The wind howled like a banshee mourning the dead, tearing through the jagged peaks of the Bitterroot Valley on that God-forsaken December night in 1889. It drove sheets of stinging ice against the hand-hewn logs of Caleb Thorne's cabin, seeking any crack or crevice to invade. Inside, the 34-year-old rancher sat close to his stone hearth, the firelight dancing across his weathered face, as he worked a strip of raw leather with methodical, calloused hands. The blizzard had descended with the sudden violence of an ambush, forcing him to drive his small herd into the box canyon for shelter hours before the sky turned a bruised purple and unleashed its fury. Caleb paused in his work, his head cocked to the side, listening to the groan of the roof timbers under the assault of the gale. He had weathered 12 winters on this patch of Montana territory, and every single one of them had been a contest of endurance between his stubborn will and the indifference of nature. His fingers, scarred from barbed wire and rope burns, resumed their task, mending a snapped bridle by the flickering orange glow. The cabin was modest, one room, sturdy, built from lodgepole pine and chinked tight with mud and moss. But it was his fortress. A sharp crack, like a pistol shot, echoed through the night, followed by the heavy thud of a pine bough shearing off and hitting the frozen earth near the barn. Caleb rose from his chair, a fluid motion born of instinct, and reached for the Henry rifle propped against the rough wall. Living this far from the settlement of Iron Creek meant keeping a vigilant watch, even when the weather was fierce enough to kill a man in minutes. He stood listening, the rifle heavy and familiar in his grip. Then he heard it, a sound that had no place in the cacophony of the storm. It was faint, rhythmic, and desperate. 3 weak thuds against the heavy oak of his door, barely audible above the screaming wind. Caleb froze, his brow furrowing. No one with half a mind would be out in this whiteout. His nearest neighbor, Old Man Jeb, was a hermit who lived 3 miles up the ridge, and even that eccentric coot knew better than to challenge a December blizzard. Caleb approached the door cautiously, the rifle barrel lowered but ready. The knocking came again, a ghostly, frantic scratching this time. "Who's there?" Caleb bellowed, his voice gravelly from days of silence. He often went weeks without speaking a word to another human soul. No answer came from the other side, just the howling wind and a soft thud, as if something heavy had slumped against the wood. Against every instinct of self-preservation, Caleb lifted the heavy iron bar and cracked the door open. The wind immediately slammed against it, trying to rip the wood from his grip, sending a blast of powdered snow swirling into the warmth of the room. But the cold was forgotten the moment he looked down. A woman stood on his threshold, or, rather, she swayed there, tethered to, consciousness by a thread. Ice crystals coated her dark lashes and clung to her hair, which had escaped its pins to hang in frozen dark ropes around a face devoid of blood. Her traveling dress, a fine navy wool completely unsuited for the frontier, was soaked through and frozen stiff, creating a rigid shell around her shivering form. She clutched a tapestry carpetbag with hands so blue they looked like bruised marble. "Help," she rasped, the word merely a shape her lips made rather than a sound. "Please." Caleb dropped the rifle. He didn't think. He simply reacted. As her eyes rolled back and she pitched forward, he caught her. She felt impossibly light, like a bird hollowed out by winter, a fragile bundle of ice and wet wool. He hauled her inside, kicking the door shut against the screaming night and sliding the bolt home. "God in heaven," he muttered, carrying her to the bearskin rug before the roaring hearth. Her skin was as cold as the river stones in January. He laid her down, her frozen dress crackling as it touched the floor, and immediately threw 3 more logs onto the fire, stoking it until the heat was blistering. The woman's eyes fluttered open. They were a startling, piercing amber, like whiskey held up to the light, before they rolled back again. Her body began to convulse with violent tremors. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Caleb knelt beside her, his large hands hovering, unsure. He had birthed calves in a snowstorm and set broken bones, but he had never tended to a half-frozen woman who looked like she belonged in a city parlor. She nodded weakly, her teeth chattering with a sound like dice rattling in a cup. "We have to get you warm," Caleb said, his voice urgent. He moved with efficient speed, stripping the heavy wool blankets from his narrow cot in the corner. He returned to her, then hesitated, a flush creeping up his neck that had nothing to do with the fire. "Ma'am," he started, clearing his throat awkwardly. That dress, it's frozen solid. It's got to come off, or the hypothermia will take you. Her eyes snapped open, wide with panic and humiliation. I can't, she whispered. You have to, he insisted, his tone brooking no argument but softened by kindness. I'll turn my back. There's a clean flannel shirt of mine right there. Wrap yourself in the blankets. I swear on my mother's Bible, I won't look. She stared at him for a heartbeat, assessing the rugged lines of his face, and then gave a jerky nod. Caleb stood and turned to face the log wall, staring at the chinking with intense fascination. He listened to the agonizingly slow rustle of stiff, wet fabric, the soft gasps of pain as her frozen fingers fumbled with buttons, and the chattering of her teeth. He counted the knots in the pine. 1, 2, 3, 4, forcing his mind to stay blank, to give her the dignity she was fighting to keep. I'm ready, came a voice, frail as a dried leaf. Caleb turned. She was huddled in the center of his, blankets swallowed by the wool, his red flannel shirt buttoned wrong at the neck. Her wet dress lay in a sodden, miserable heap on the floor. Her lips were still blue, but a faint stain of color was returning to her high cheekbones. Caleb moved to the stove, pouring a mug of sludge-thick coffee, then ladled out a bowl of the venison stew that had been simmering in the cast-iron pot since dawn. Can you hold this? He asked gently, offering the tin cup. Her hands shook so violently the coffee sloshed over the rim. Caleb reached out, his large, rough hands steadying hers, guiding the cup to her lips. She drank greedily, choking slightly on the heat, but sighing as the warmth hit her belly. Thank you, she whispered, the tremors beginning to subside. I was certain this was the end. What in the name of all that's holy were you doing out there? The question burst out of him, harsher than he intended, born of the adrenaline fading. In a storm like this? Tears welled in her amber eyes, shimmering in the firelight, but she blinked them back with a ferocity that surprised him. I had nowhere else to go. Caleb handed her the stew and sat on the floor a respectful distance away, leaning against the wood box. Eat. Then, if you're willing, tell me how a lady from the city ends up freezing on my doorstep. She ate mechanically at first, then with the hunger of the starving. Caleb watched her, noting the details he had missed in the panic. Her hands were soft, unblemished by labor. A simple gold band glinted on her left hand. She was beautiful, in a sharp, classical way, but there was a steeliness in her jaw that suggested she wasn't as fragile as she looked. When the bowl was empty, she pulled the blankets tighter, creating a cocoon. My name is Elara, she said, her voice gaining strength. Elara Vance. I'm from Boston. Or I was. She paused, looking into the flames. I came here to be a wife. A mail-order bride? Caleb asked. It wasn't uncommon in the territory, though usually the women knew what they were getting into. Elara nodded slowly. I answered an advertisement from a rancher, Silas Sterling. He wrote beautiful letters. He spoke of loneliness, of wanting a partner to build a legacy, of a large home with a garden. She let out a bitter, jagged laugh. He promised me a home. Caleb's jaw tightened. He knew Silas Sterling. Everyone in the valley knew him. He owned the Double Bar S, the biggest spread in the territory, and he walked through town like a king. He was also a man known for a temper that could snap like a dry twig and a cruelty that he wore like a badge of honor. I arrived in Iron Creek this morning on the stage, Elara continued, her voice trembling with suppressed rage. Mr. Sterling met me. He took one look at me and... She swallowed hard. He said I wasn't what he ordered. He said I was too slight, too bookish, too Eastern. He poked at me like I was a horse at an auction. He said he needed a breeder and a worker, not a library ornament. Caleb felt a dark heat rise in his chest. He rejected you? He did more than that, Elara said, looking up, her eyes burning. He drove me in his wagon to the crossroads, 5 miles from town. The snow was just starting. He stopped the wagon, threw my bag into the mud, and told me to walk back to town. He said the exercise might toughen me up for the next fool. He left you? Caleb's voice dropped to a dangerous growl. In December? 5 miles from shelter? He laughed as he rode away, Elara whispered. He said if I hurried, I might beat the storm. But the whiteout came so fast, I lost the road, I wandered for hours. I saw your light. It was the only thing in the world. Caleb stood up and paced the small room, his fists clenching and unclenching. That man is a snake, leaving a woman to die. That's attempted murder, in my book. Elara fumbled at her neck, pulling out a crumpled, damp envelope. He left this with me, said it was my severance. Caleb took the paper. It was a hastily scrawled note, cold and transactional, stating that Silas Sterling dissolved any contract with Miss Vance due to misrepresentation of goods, and enclosed $10 for her return passage. $10, Elara said, staring at the fire. As if my life was worth $10. Caleb crumpled the letter and tossed it into the flames. They watched the paper curl and blacken, the ink vanishing into ash. You stay here, he said firmly. As long as you need, the storm will blow itself out in a day or two. Then I'll take you to town. We'll go to the sheriff. What he did was criminal. I have no money, Elara said, looking down. I sold everything to come here. That $10 is all I have. We'll figure it out, Caleb said. You take the cot. I'll bunk here by the fire. I couldn't possibly. You can and you will, he said, his tone leaving no room for debate. You've survived hell today, Miss Vance. Rest. As the fire popped and the wind screamed outside, Caleb lay on the rug, staring at the ceiling shadows. He thought about Silas Sterling, a man who had everything, land, money, power, and treated people like cattle. And he thought about the woman sleeping in his bed, who had walked through a blizzard rather than lay down and die. He barely knew her, but he knew courage when he saw it. And he knew that his quiet, solitary life had just been shattered, as surely as that pine branch outside. The storm raged for 3 days. It buried the cabin in drifts so high they darkened the windows, turning the interior into a twilight world of firelight and quiet intimacy. For those 3 days, the world outside ceased to exist. Inside, a tentative rhythm formed. By the second morning, Elara insisted on helping. I will not be a burden, she declared, standing in the middle of the room, wrapped in a blanket, looking like an imperious queen in exile. I may be from Boston, Mr. Thorne, but I am not helpless. Caleb, he corrected her, slicing bacon into a skillet. And I never thought you were. She proved to be a quick study. She took over the cooking, turning his simple rations of flour, beans, and dried meat into meals that actually had flavor. She found his stash of dried herbs and used them with a precision he found fascinating. They talked. At first, it was hesitant, small shards of biography exchanged over coffee. But as the hours stretched, the walls came down. Caleb learned that her father had been a schoolmaster who died penniless, leaving her with a brilliant mind and no dowry. He learned she had read more books than he knew existed, that she could recite poetry, and that she had a dry, biting wit that made him laugh out loud, a rusty sound he hadn't heard in years. You mean to tell me, Elara asked on the third evening as she mended a tear in his coat, that you have lived here alone for 12 years because you prefer cows to people? Caleb looked up from whittling a piece of cedar. Cows don't lie, Elara, and they generally don't try to cheat you. People are complicated. Lonely, though? She observed softly. Peaceful, he countered, but looking at her now, with the firelight catching the amber in her eyes and the soft curve of her neck, the peace he had cherished suddenly felt heavy and hollow. Why did you really answer that ad? He asked, the question hanging in the warm air. Elara stopped sewing. Because I wanted to matter, she said, her voice raw. In the city I was a spinster, a poor relation, invisible. I foolishly thought that out here, facing the elements, building something new, I could be a partner, an equal. I wanted a life that was mine. Caleb looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the strength in her hands, the intelligence in her eyes, and the fierce determination that the storm hadn't been able to freeze out of her. You matter, he said, his voice rough. You matter a great deal. The air between them charged, a static electricity that had nothing to do with the weather. Elara looked down, a blush rising on her cheeks, but she didn't pull away. Thank you, Caleb. When the storm finally broke on the fourth morning, the sun dazzled off a world sculpted from diamond dust. They stood on the porch, blinking in the brightness. The beauty was breathtaking, but it brought a heavy realization. The road was open. I should take you to town, Caleb said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "Yes," Elara said, looking at the horizon, her shoulders slumping slightly. "I suppose you must." But before they could saddle the horses, the sound of riders shattered the morning peace. 3 men were picking their way through the drifts toward the cabin. Caleb recognized the lead horse immediately, a massive black stallion. "Get inside," Caleb ordered, his hand dropping to the Colt Peacemaker on his hip. "It's him," Elara whispered, her face draining of color. "It's Sterling." "I said get inside, Elara." "No." She stepped up beside him, chin high. "I am done running from bullies." Silas Sterling rode into the yard, flanked by 2 of his hired guns. He looked every inch the lord of the manor, fur-lined coat, silver-studded saddle, and a face that was handsome until you saw the rot in his eyes. "Well, well," Sterling sneered, looking from Caleb to Elara. "Thorne, I heard rumors you had a guest. Didn't think you had it in you to harbor stolen property." "She ain't property, Sterling," Caleb said, his voice deadly calm. "And she ain't stolen. You threw her away." "I've reconsidered," Sterling said, dismounting with an arrogant swagger. "It seems my investors prefer a family man. A wife is necessary for the image. I'm here to collect her." "Collect me?" Elara stepped forward, fury radiating from her. "I am not a parcel of feed, Mr. Sterling. You dissolved our agreement. I have the letter." Sterling laughed, a cold, ugly sound. "A letter written in haste. I'm willing to overlook your nights spent in this hovel. You'll come with me now? We have a wedding to prepare for." "I would rather freeze to death 1,000 times over than go anywhere with you," Elara spat. Sterling's face darkened. "You have a debt, woman. I paid your passage. That makes you mine until you work it off." He moved toward the porch. "Now, get on the horse." Caleb stepped in front of her, his chest acting as a wall. She said no. "Step aside, Thorne," Sterling warned, his hand hovering near his gun. "You're a nobody, a dirt-scratching hermit. You think you can stand against me?" "I think you better get off my land," Caleb said, "before I bury you in it." The tension stretched tight as a bowstring. Sterling's hired hands shifted nervously. They knew Caleb Thorne wasn't a man to be trifled with. He was a crack shot and known for being hard as the granite mountains. Suddenly, a 4th rider crested the hill. It was Sheriff Brody, his badge glinting in the sun. "Problem here, gents?" the lawman called out, his voice casual but carrying authority. Sterling straightened, forcing a smile. "Just retrieving my fiancée, Sheriff. Thorne here is confusing hospitality with kidnapping." "She's not his fiancée," Caleb said. "He abandoned her in the blizzard. Attempted murder, Brody. She's got a letter proving he cut her loose." The sheriff looked at Elara. "That true, miss?" "Every word," Elara said firmly. "He left me to die." Sheriff Brody's eyes hardened as he looked at Sterling. "That's a hanging offense if a judge sees it right, Silas. If the lady doesn't want to go, she doesn't go." Sterling looked between the sheriff and Caleb, calculating the odds. He sneered, swinging back onto his horse. "Have it your way, but you'll regret this, Vance. And you, Thorne. No one crosses me in this valley and prospers. I'll run you out, both of you." He wheeled his horse and galloped away, snow flying from the hooves. "You folks all right?" the sheriff asked. "We are now," Caleb said, but his eyes were on the retreating figures. "He won't stop, will he?" "Not likely," Brody sighed. "Watch your back, Caleb." The days that followed were a mix of bliss and siege. Word spread through Iron Creek like wildfire. The town was divided. The women whispered behind their hands about the fallen woman living in sin at the Thorne cabin. The men muttered about Caleb stealing Sterling's bride. When they went to town for supplies, the silence in the general store was deafening. "Let them stare," Elara said, holding her head high as they walked down the boardwalk. But Caleb saw her hand trembling. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I've ruined your reputation." "My reputation?" She laughed softly. "Caleb, you saved my life. You gave me shelter. You treated me with more respect in 5 minutes than Silas Sterling has in his entire life. I don't care what these people think." But the pressure mounted. One afternoon, Reverend Mills rode out to the cabin. He was a stern man, thin as a rail, with a face etched in judgment. "Mr. Thorne," the Reverend began, standing in the yard, "this arrangement cannot continue. It is a stain on the community's moral fabric. An unmarried woman living here, it is scandalous." She was stranded, Reverend, Caleb said, chopping wood with violent strokes. Would you have preferred she died in a snowbank? Would that have been more moral? The crisis has passed, the Reverend insisted. She must move to town, the boarding house, where Sterling can get to her. Caleb stopped chopping. No. Then you must marry her, the Reverend said. If you are honorable, you will make an honest woman of her. Caleb looked at the cabin window, where Elara was watching. If I marry her, it will be because I love her, not because you or this town demands it. The Reverend rode away in a huff, but the seed was sown. Caleb realized with a start that he didn't want Elara to leave, not because of safety, but because the cabin felt empty when she wasn't in the room. The attack came 2 weeks later, not with guns, but with paper. A boy rode up with a telegram. Elara opened it, her face going pale. "It's from Boston," she said, her voice shaking. "From a William Vance, my brother. It says my mother is dying and I must return immediately. Ticket waits at the station." "You don't have a brother," Caleb said slowly. "No," Elara whispered. "I was an only child, and my mother died 3 years ago." "It's Sterling," Caleb growled. "He's trying to trick you onto a stagecoach, get you out of the valley so he can claim you or shame you." "He thinks I'm stupid," Elara said, a cold anger replacing her fear. "He thinks I'm just a frightened girl. I want to go to town, Caleb. I want to face him." The showdown happened in the town square, in front of the bank. Sterling was there, holding court with the mayor, looking smug. When he saw Caleb and Elara wagon approach, he smiled. "Miss Vance," Sterling called out loudly, drawing a crowd. "Thank heavens, you received the urgent news. I have purchased your ticket out of the kindness of my heart. Your poor mother." Elara climbed down from the wagon. She didn't look at the ground. She looked straight at him. "My mother is dead, Mr. Sterling. She has been for years. And I have no brother." The crowd murmured. Sterling's smile faltered. "Clearly the grief. The stress has addled your mind. I have the telegram right here." "Forged," Caleb shouted, stepping up beside her. "Just like your honor." "Sheriff!" Sterling barked. "This man is holding a mentally unstable woman against her will. She needs to be put on that stage for her own good." Sheriff Brody stepped off the boardwalk. He held a piece of paper of his own. "Funny thing, Silas. After Caleb told me about the brother, I wired Boston authorities myself. Turns out there is no William Vance, and the death certificate for Mrs. Vance is dated 1886. The town went silent. The lie hung in the air, naked and ugly. "You tried to trick her," the baker's wife whispered loud enough for everyone to hear. "You liar." Sterling's face turned a mottled purple. "I am the future of this valley. I brought commerce here. This woman is a nobody, a penniless leech." "This woman," Caleb said, his voice ringing off the storefronts, "has more integrity in her little finger than you have in your whole empire. She is staying. And if you ever come near her or my land again, I won't wait for the sheriff." Sterling looked around. He saw the judgment in the eyes of the townspeople, people he had bullied and bought for years. The spell was broken. He spat on the ground, turned on his heel, and stormed into the bank. Elara stood trembling as the adrenaline faded. Caleb took her hand in front of everyone. "Let's go home," he said. That evening, the sunset painted the snow in shades of violet and rose. They sat on the porch, wrapped in buffalo robes. "You faced him down," Caleb said admiringly. "We faced him down," Elara corrected. She turned to him, her eyes searching his face. "Caleb, the Reverend, he said something that day. He said a lot of things. He said we should marry." Caleb looked away. "I won't force you into anything, Elara. You have your freedom now. You can do whatever you want." "What if I want you?" she asked softly. Caleb's head snapped back. "I'm a rough man, Elara. I have nothing but this cabin and some cows. I can't give you the life you were promised." "You gave me a life I didn't know I wanted," she said, reaching out to touch his rough cheek. "You gave me safety. You gave me laughter. You listened to me. Silas promised me a house. You gave me a home." "I love you," Caleb blurted out, the words tearing loose from his chest. "I think I loved you from the moment you refused to let me see you naked in that blanket." Elara laughed, a joyous sound. "And I love you, Caleb Thorne. So, are you going to ask me, or do I have to propose to you?" "Marry me," he whispered, pulling her close. Be my wife. Yes, she said against his lips. 1,000 times, yes. The wedding was not the grand affair Silas Sterling had promised. It was better. It took place 2 weeks later, under the great pine tree in the yard. The air was crisp, smelling of evergreen and wood smoke. Sheriff Brody stood as best man. Old man Jeb came down from the ridge, wearing a suit from 1860. The baker's wife brought a cake. Even the Reverend Mills looked pleased as he opened his book. Elara wore a dress of cream-colored calico that she and the women of the town had sewn together. She carried a bouquet of dried winter berries and pine boughs. As she walked toward Caleb, who looked uncomfortable but handsome in a clean black coat, the wind whispered through the trees, not a howl this time, but a blessing. I, Caleb, take thee, Elara. His voice cracked, but his grip on her hands was iron strong. To have and to hold, she finished for him, her eyes shining. When they kissed, a cheer went up that echoed off the mountains. It was a victory of love over greed, of warmth over the freezing cold. 5 years later, the valley was green, lush with summer grass. The cabin had grown, a second room had been added, and a fenced garden burst with vegetables and wildflowers. Elara stood at the window, watching a small boy with dark hair chase a golden retriever through the tall grass. A baby girl slept in a cradle by the fire, cooing softly. The door opened, and Caleb walked in, dusting soil from his trousers. He looked older, the lines around his eyes deeper, but the loneliness was gone, replaced by a quiet contentment. He's fast, Caleb said, nodding toward the boy. Gonna be a runner. He takes after his father, Elara smiled, pouring him a cup of coffee. A rider approached the gate. It was not a threat this time, but a curiosity. A man in a dusty suit, looking defeated and weary. It was Silas Sterling. He had lost the double bar S to the investors years ago after a series of bad decisions and a lack of local support. He was leaving the territory, a broken man. He stopped his horse at the fence and looked at the cabin, at the flowers, the playing child, the smoke rising from the chimney. Caleb stepped out onto the porch, Elara beside him. They didn't say a word. They didn't need to. They stood together, a united front, living proof of his failure. Sterling looked at Elara, really looked at her, and saw the radiance of a woman who was cherished. He saw the life he could have had if he hadn't been a fool. He tipped his hat, a gesture of reluctant respect, and rode on, disappearing down the dusty road, a ghost of the past. Do you ever wonder, Caleb asked, wrapping his arm around her waist, what would have happened if he hadn't left you that night? I would have been the poorest woman in the world, Elara said, leaning her head on his shoulder. Instead, I am the richest. No regrets? Not a one. They stood there as the sun dipped below the peaks, casting long shadows across the land they had tamed together. The wind blew softly, carrying the scent of pine and the sound of their son's laughter. It was a hard life, a rugged life, but it was theirs. And as the stars began to prick the velvet sky above Montana, Caleb and Elara Thorne turned back into their home, closing the door on the night, safe in the warmth of a love that had survived the storm. Did you enjoy this tale of romance and resilience on the American frontier? If this story warmed your heart, please subscribe to the channel for more epic tales of the Wild West. We post new stories every week, bringing history and romance to life. Leave a comment below. Do you think Silas Sterling got what he deserved? What would you have done in Elara's shoes? Share this story with a friend who loves a happy ending. Until next time, keep your fires burning bright.